I always believed I had everything figured out. My marriage, though not perfect, seemed stable enough. We'd built a life together, a home that others might have envied. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form, tiny fissures that widened with each passing day. My husband, though kind and dependable, had grown distant. It wasn't intentional, but the little things, the affection, the attention, the warmth, had started to slip away. And I, caught in the monotony of our lives, found myself yearning for something I couldn't quite name. Then there was my stepson, Alex. He had entered my life in his late teens after his father and I married. Polite, reserved, and fiercely independent, he was the kind of young man who rarely let anyone see past his composed exterior. We didn't talk much beyond the pleasantries exchanged in a household. Still, I often found myself curious about the layers beneath his stoic demeanor. There was an unspoken respect between us, but also a distance I never fully understood. Life had a way of blending days into weeks and weeks into months. I began filling the void in my marriage with distractions, books, long walks, moments of solitude in a world I created for myself. Yet, those fleeting escapes couldn't mask the loneliness creeping in. There were nights I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was how love was supposed to feel after years of being together, muted, familiar, but void of the spark that once lit up our lives. Alex was often away, caught up in his studies and social life. When he was home, his presence was subdued. I rarely noticed him around the house for more than a few minutes at a time. It wasn't intentional neglect on my part, but I suppose I treated him as an afterthought, someone who was part of the home but existed in the periphery. He didn't seem to mind. At least I never thought he did. But then came that fateful evening, the one that would change the quiet, predictable rhythm of our lives. It was one of those nights when the house felt too large, too empty. My husband was away on a work trip, as he often was, and the silence weighed heavily on me. I remember sitting alone, nursing a glass of wine, trying to lose myself in a book that no longer held my attention. The loneliness felt sharper that night, more pronounced. Looking back, I should have recognized the signs, the subtle way my emotions had been building up, the yearning for something, anything, to break the monotony. But in that moment, all I knew was the ache of solitude, the longing for connection. And so, I let my guard down, retreating further into my own world, oblivious to the impact it might have on those around me. It was a night like any other, and yet, I couldn't have anticipated how profoundly everything was about to change. The evening air hung heavy, a mixture of stillness and the faint hum of life beyond the walls of the house. I had grown used to this solitude, even if it often felt suffocating. That night, I sought comfort in the familiar, an attempt to fill the emptiness with something tangible. The glass of wine in my hand offered a temporary reprieve, and the soft glow of the room felt like a fragile cocoon, shielding me from the world outside. I had let my guard down in ways I didn't often allow myself to. There was no one to judge, no eyes to observe. It felt safe to be vulnerable in my private world. As I sat there, I lost track of time, the minutes blending together as I allowed my mind to wander. It wasn't about seeking pleasure or distraction. It was about reclaiming something I felt I had lost. What I didn't know was that I wasn't alone. Somewhere in the quiet shadows of the house, Alex had returned home earlier than expected. I hadn't heard the door, hadn't noticed the faint creak of the floorboards that might have alerted me to his presence. Lost in my thoughts, I remained unaware of how close he was, of how the boundaries I thought were intact were about to be crossed in the most unexpected way. When I finally looked up, the sight of him standing there froze me in place. My breath caught in my throat as a wave of shock and embarrassment washed over me. Alex's expression was unreadable at first, a mix of confusion and something else I couldn't quite place. His presence in that moment was a jolt, breaking the fragile bubble I had encased myself in. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Neither of us spoke, the silence between us laden with unspoken words and emotions we couldn't yet articulate. I could see the discomfort in his stance, the way his eyes darted as though searching for an explanation. I wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the chasm that had suddenly opened between us, but the words wouldn't come. Alex's reaction wasn't what I had expected, though I wasn't entirely sure what I had anticipated. He didn't turn away immediately. There was no anger, no accusations, only a quiet intensity in his gaze that unnerved me. It was as though he was trying to understand, to piece together a puzzle he hadn't been prepared to confront. Finally, he stepped back, retreating into the shadows as quietly as he had appeared. The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving me alone once more. But the air in the room had changed, charged with an energy I couldn't ignore. The safety I had felt moments earlier was gone, replaced by an acute awareness of what had just transpired. I sat there for a long time, replaying the moment in my mind, trying to make sense of it. What had he seen? What had he thought? And most importantly, how had it come to this? The questions swirled, unanswered, as I grappled with the weight of the moment. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't yet define but knew would linger far longer than I was prepared for. The hours that followed were a blur of tension and uncertainty. I couldn't shake the image of Alex standing there, his expression etched into my mind. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a space filled with unspoken words and invisible walls. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of the stairs, the rustle of movement upstairs, as if the very air carried the weight of what had happened. I avoided Alex the next morning, unsure of how to face him. The thought of what he might be thinking consumed me. Had I crossed an unspoken line? Had he? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I went about my routine mechanically, trying to focus on anything other than the lingering tension. But it was impossible to escape the reality that we would eventually have to confront what had transpired. Later that evening, it happened. Alex approached me, his movements hesitant but deliberate. His presence alone made my pulse quicken, though I couldn't tell if it was from fear or something else entirely. He stood a few feet away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I didn't mean to walk in on you," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. There was no accusation in his tone, only an uncomfortable sincerity that made my chest tighten. I swallowed hard, struggling to find the right response. "I didn't know you were home," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It felt like a weak excuse, but it was all I had. He nodded, as if he understood, but the silence that followed was unbearable. I could feel the weight of his gaze now, his eyes searching mine for some kind of explanation or reassurance. I wanted to offer him clarity, to ease the tension, but I didn't know how. "I guess I just wasn't expecting to see you like that," he admitted, his cheeks tinged with a hint of color. His vulnerability caught me off guard, breaking through the layers of composure he usually wore. "I didn't mean for you to," I replied, my words carrying an edge of desperation. "It wasn't something you were supposed to see." For a moment, we both stood there, caught in the fragile space between apology and understanding. There was no roadmap for navigating this kind of situation, no script to follow. All we had was the shared discomfort of a moment neither of us had intended to happen. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, his voice firm. "I shouldn't have been there. It's my fault." "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." His eyes met mine then, filled with a complexity I couldn't decipher. There was guilt, yes, but also something deeper, an unspoken question, a lingering uncertainty about where we stood now. "I just don't want things to be weird," he said finally, his voice almost pleading. "Neither do I," I replied softly. But even as I said it, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Some things couldn't be undone, and some moments stayed with you, shaping the way you saw the world and each other. The days that followed were marked by an unspoken effort to return to normalcy, but the memory of that night lingered between us like a shadow neither of us could ignore. I caught myself overthinking every interaction, questioning whether Alex felt the same awkwardness I did, or if he was simply better at hiding it. Still, there was no denying that something fundamental had shifted. Alex seemed quieter than usual, his presence subdued in a way that was hard to miss. He avoided lingering in the same room for too long, and when we spoke, it was brief and to the point. Yet, beneath the surface, I could sense he was grappling with emotions he wasn't ready to share. I wanted to say something, to break through the barrier between us, but every time I opened my mouth, the words felt insufficient. One evening, the tension became too much to bear. I found him sitting alone in the living room, his expression distant. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if I should approach him, but I knew avoiding the situation any longer would only make things worse. I sat down across from him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Alex," I began carefully, "about the other night. I just want to make sure you're okay." He looked up at me, startled by the directness of my approach. For a moment, he didn't respond, as if weighing his words carefully. "I'm fine," he said finally, though his tone betrayed the truth. "You don't have to pretend with me," I said gently. "I know things have been strange since then, and I hate that it's made you uncomfortable." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that I'm uncomfortable," he admitted. "I just don't know how to act around you anymore. It's like everything feels different now." "I know what you mean," I said, nodding. "But I want you to understand something. What happened wasn't about you, and it wasn't something I ever wanted you to see. It was a mistake, one I deeply regret." He studied me for a long moment, his gaze searching mine for sincerity. "I don't think it was a mistake," he said quietly, surprising me. "I think it just happened, and maybe it's something we both need to move past." His words struck a chord, a blend of maturity and understanding I hadn't expected. "You're right," I said after a moment. "We can't let this define how we interact or how we see each other. I care about you, Alex, and the last thing I want is for this to come between us." He nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I care about you too," he said. "And I don't want this to change anything. I just need time to figure things out." "Take all the time you need," I replied, relief washing over me. "Just know I'm here if you ever want to talk about anything." For the first time in days, the tension between us seemed to lift, replaced by a tentative understanding. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start, a step toward healing and moving forward. In that moment, I realized that while the past couldn't be undone, the future was still ours to shape, one conversation at a time.